Today we are talking about social safety nets with guest speaker Gayani Hurulle, and it's hosted by yours truly. See you in the studio in a bit. Welcome to Advocata's podcast Reset Now, where we take an in-depth look into some of the most pressing issues and challenges in Sri Lanka. Today, we are joined with Gayani Hurulle, and she is the Senior Research Manager at Learn Asia, and we are here to tackle the problem on social safety nets. Gayani, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So, Gayani, I think we'll start off with setting some context on social safety nets in Sri Lanka. So, I want to start off by asking, how important are social safety nets in Sri Lanka?
I mean, social safety nets are so important in the current context, right? Because we're dealing with an economic crisis. We're dealing with millions of people living in poverty simply because they aren't able to afford food. They're not able to get fuel to earn their livelihoods. People are really suffering. So it's really important that we have social safety nets to really catch people when they fall, because we need to help keep people afloat as we try to recover from this crisis.
So right now there is a lifeline, but should there be something more in time to come? Like, should there be a layer of protection against risk, a driver of entrepreneurship and innovation? How would you strike a balance between these positives and the argument often made that people will take advantage of a payout?
Right. So I think when we need to step back a little bit and really understand what social safety nets are, right? So there are multiple different types of definitions that have been put out, some by the ILO, some by different types of UN agencies, some by the World Bank. But I quite like the one that has been put out by the World Bank, which really stresses the fact that social safety nets are there to protect people at a time of crisis, right? So we're talking about a household crisis where the main breadwinner of the family has passed away, right? Unprecedented. It's not accounted for, right? So you need to think about things like that. It could be a natural disaster. It could be an economic crisis like this one. It could be a drought, which has left many farmers, without a livelihood. So the unprecedented nature of that is really important. And then you're not really thinking about it from a livelihoods perspective, or how do you build back better, right? It's, again, I'm stressing this again, is just keeping people afloat. That being said, you need to then think about Sri Lanka's social protection, that framework a little bit more broadly as well, because social safety nets almost lives as a part of that, right? So if you look at Sri Lanka's entire social protection regime, we have social insurance, right? So this could be pension schemes, this could be EPF, ETF, and other types of contributory schemes. You could be talking about farmer and fisherman type schemes, which are for the informal sector, which unfortunately are very lacking in terms of their coverage. So this really is an opportunity to try and see if we can make some reforms in that. There's social assistance programs. Those are things like Samurdhi that you hear people talking about quite a lot. And there's a big need to reform that sort of program as well. So we need to think about that. We need to think about livelihood development, which is what you spoke about earlier. Because in the end, what we want to do is we need to cushion people from this crisis, but you also want to give them the means to be able to earn a livelihood and not depend on the social safety net, right? So there is an opportunity to reform the entire sector or the entire area a little bit more broadly. And those of us who work in policy often call these policy windows, right? And ideally would want these to, you would want to work on reforming the social safety nets and this sort of thing when the times are good, so that the people can be cushioned at the time when the times are bad. But unfortunately, we haven't had the privilege of doing that. So even though the times are bad right now, this really seems to be the time to drive change, and it makes sense to do that. I want to go back to another part of your question in which you asked, how do you balance between, making sure that people don't take advantage
Yeah.
of this sort of payout. And once again, I think we need to think about this in context, right? So there's actually a plethora of evidence on this. And even when Laneja, when we started working on cash transfers, this is one of the first things that we looked at. So what we found is that when you look at systematic reviews, from which are really the most robust types of evidence, you find that there's evidence to show from 19 different countries that people, even though people get this cash to hand, they don't necessarily spend it on demerit goods like tobacco and alcohol, which is one of the big criticisms, right? People think you get the money and then that's going to be spent on that. There is no evidence to show that the consumption of those increases significantly with this. Now, one of the other big criticisms is that it's going to prevent people from working, right? And you're going to create a culture of overdependence. But once again, the literature doesn't really seem to support that. In fact, there are studies from a bunch of countries, Mexico, Nicaragua, Philippines, and so on. And what they show is that these cash handouts don't necessarily lead to a reduction in the propensity to work in terms of hours or, just getting people into the labor force for either men or women. So, there's no real propensity to swing that way in terms of the evidence. But of course, common sense will tell you that, and again, this is my hypothesis, but I think the size of the payout is really going to be a big factor. Because if you, like right now, the emergency handouts that are given are these 5,000 rupee grants. So now they've been inflated to about 7,500. But yet this isn't a really sizable chunk of somebody's like income, or it doesn't amount to much, right? Because if you look at the statistics, you found that in 2019, so before this entire crisis, that the amount of like income or the amount of money that a family of four would need to keep afloat was 28,000 rupees. Now, with inflation, we inflation adjusted these numbers, and we found that then in the current context, you need about 50,000 rupees to just survive, just make ends meet as per the national poverty line. So in that context, you need 50,000 rupees, but 5,000, 7,500 rupees isn't going to really push people to not work, right? It doesn't make sense in the grand scheme of things. Now, of course, if somebody gives 100,000 rupees or something a month, then it's entirely possible that the entire, equation would change. It could prevent people from working, but in the current context, I don't think it's really too much of a concern compared to the very compelling argument of just keeping people alive.
Yeah. So I know you just mentioned this just now, but to delve a little deeper into this, can you tell us a little bit more about the landscape of social safety nets in Sri Lanka, and particularly on who is eligible to be supported from a social safety net program, and what are the systems that exist currently in Sri Lanka?
Right. So again, the broad landscape, and there are many different ways to categorize this, but there are the social insurance programs, assistance programs, and the livelihood development programs. Now, the one that is most relevant when we start talking about social safety nets, especially in this crisis, is this 5,000 rupee grant, right? And well, 7,500 now, but let's just call it call it 5,000 rupee for simplicity. So the 5,000 rupee grant is given to a bunch of different types of people, right? In some senses, they use existing lists. So they'll give it to some of the beneficiaries, so who are supposed to be the low-income households. They give it to persons with disability. They give it to persons who are suffering from kidney, thalassemia, and so on. So these are from existing lists. But they've also identified that there are people who are probably not in the formal landscape in the current system right now who may need help. Right? And these could be the newly poor. So they started this scheme actually with the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's almost naturally transitioned into this. But when it started from when the entire scheme started for COVID-19, one of the other big factors that they took into consideration is people who lost their jobs due to COVID-19. So then they could go register with, a local official and then be eligible for the scheme. And then they also had these rural committees at, a village level who then identify people who really needed help. So there was that kind of bottom-up sort of selection criteria that also happened. So that's the 5,000 rupee scheme, and I thought that was quite a good example because it capitalizes on those existing lists. Now the problem is that if the people who are on those lists are people who shouldn't be getting the benefits, then you're starting from a flawed list itself, right? And this speaks to one of the big issues in social safety nets or any sort of social protection scheme in Sri Lanka, and that is that we have a targeting problem. Right? So Lanesia did a survey last year. It was really to look at COVID impact, but lends itself very nicely to the issue that we're talking about today. So we found that in general, if you look at all the households in Sri Lanka, about 30% receive regular benefits, right? So that could be Samurdhi, that could be Pama, which is also called Ping Padi, which is given to the elderly, disability, and so on. And you found that if you then break this down by socioeconomic categories, so essentially looking at it by wealth and income, education, those kind of variables, you find that 7% of those in socioeconomic group A, so those are really the wealthiest people, are getting these regular benefits, which is quite unheard of, right? You wouldn't expect them to be getting this. On the other hand, we're dealing with a much bigger issue, right? So if you look at socioeconomic group E, which is really the poorest of the poor, 55% of them aren't getting any sort of benefits. So you're dealing with a really severe problem, and this targeting problem has to be solved. So that's why actually, even when you talk about these the 5,000 rupee grant, they have to give eligibility to people who are on Samurdhi waiting lists. And sometimes those are the people who need it most, but they only have a limited number of slots. So then, they're really left out of the system. So it's a challenge in that sense.
Thank you very much for setting some context. I think we want to move more and talk about the current problems with social safety nets in Sri Lanka. So I want to ask you, Gayani, do you have an accurate understanding of what it looks like post-COVID and now in the context of the present economic crisis?
Right. So I can maybe give you some insights in terms of looking at how many people need assistance, right? Because this is one of the big issues. So pre-COVID, in 2019, there was a household income and expenditure survey done by the Department of Census and Statistics. And that really has been so insightful in helping us understand the context in which we were operating pre-COVID. So there we found that 3 million people, that's about 14% of our population, were living under the poverty line. And that's essentially where there's each individual is spending less than 7,000 rupees a month. Right? So that's our poverty line. Now, we've seen COVID, we've seen fertilizer bans, which have impacted the agricultural community. We've seen sudden dollar depreciations. We've seen just a dollar shortage, which has made importing things hard. It's certainly made importing fuel and gas and those sort of goods that are needed to produce all these other goods, so these intermediary products, they've become scarce and very, very expensive. So what this has done is that it has reduced people's incomes in many ways because people have lost their livelihoods, and it has increased expenditures for everyone. And, that has become really tough for people. And now I think the UN had given an estimate in June this year, saying that about 6 million people need humanitarian assistance. So we started with 3 million people being under the poverty line. We don't know right now how many people are under the poverty line. We're actually doing some surveys to try to figure that out. But we certainly know that at least double need humanitarian assistance, which shows you that the situation is quite dire. It could have actually got worse over time. So it's not a great starting point.
So also want to see, does our current system account for the near poor, and does it adjust accordingly? I believe the population of near poor in Sri Lanka is quite high. I think, as you just mentioned.
Right. So that's actually an interesting concept, right? Because
Yeah.
again, let's go back to the basics
Yeah.
in terms of how does Sri Lanka define its poor,
Okay.
right? So and that's really through a poverty line, right? So how do they define this poverty line? They look at food and non-food expenditure that is needed to keep someone going, right? So there's a food basket. So a certain organization, I believe, a medical organization, had deemed that on average, an individual needs to consume about 2,000 kilocalories a day to survive, right?
Okay.
So what our statisticians and medical officers and so on have done is that they have decided the expenditure that is needed to buy enough goods to fulfill that calorie requirement, right? So they've seen how expensive it is to buy that basket of goods to fulfill that, right? Then they've also looked at the costs that need to be incurred to live on a day-to-day basis on non-food expenditure. So on education, on clothing, on housing, on all these other things. And then they've decided that, okay, this is the base standard of living. This is how much money you need to fulfill this sort of requirement, right? And that is how the poverty line is defined. Now, we do deal with the problem of people living above that poverty line, right? So now one could argue that this line that is created is quite arbitrary. But talking about having separate schemes for the non-poor may be quite tricky, because then you're always raising the bar, right? And you're constantly chasing something that is being raised.
Yeah.
Now, that is the tricky part, right? Now, over time, you have seen that the poverty line has got adjusted, right? So you use a basket of goods that is relevant in a certain year, and then you look at the costs of that, and then you start adjusting it from time to time. In fact, if you look at the 2019 HIS, they had done that. So initially, I think several years ago, they were using 5,000 rupees as the base expenditure, that bar. Now they raised it to 7,000. So that sort of adjustment happens from time to time. So then the proportion of the population living in poverty went from 3% to 14%. So over time, that sort of adjustment has happened, and I think that's necessary. But I would be a little cautious before having, constantly thinking about raising it from like month to month, because that could be quite tricky. I do want to say that there are some countries that have done away with this poverty line altogether, right? There are countries, Singapore, Canada, New Zealand, I believe. I know certainly Singapore has done it. But then they deal with welfare in a very different way, right? So then they just have targeted schemes for needy communities, and they don't think about this baseline. But I do think that there are benefits of having this poverty line, because it gives us some indication of where people need most help, right? And of course, you need to do better for your entire population, see how you can make everyone grow. But I do think that it's necessary to focus on the poorest, because they're the people who need it most.
Yeah. So I do understand that there are multiple challenges. So when it comes to the current system that is in place in Sri Lanka, so I want to move into each one of those challenges. But starting off, what would you say is the current challenge in terms of targeting?
Right. So targeting, I think we spoke about briefly earlier, right? In that the people who really need benefits are sometimes not getting it, and those people who don't need it are getting it. So this is the challenge. And there are multiple different ways through which you can address it.
Okay.
Right? Now, if you take Samurdhi, for example, the base issue there is that you have to look at eligibility criteria, right? So if you look at the eligibility criteria for Samurdhi, a household needs to earn less than 6,000 rupees a month. Right, to be eligible, and that's actually a very, very low base, right? You can see it's significantly lower than the poverty line that we were talking about in terms of a household as well. So there's a fundamental problem there. But the issue is that many people who would actually need samurti are people who are working in the informal sector. So there's no way that they can actually prove what their income is. Right, so then you have to go through, somebody else has to vouch for you. You need to go through this committee, and then it can get politicized, right? Which unfortunately is a reality of the system within which we work today. So then there have been all these other kinds of mechanisms that have been proposed to try deal with this problem, right? So one of it is using this method called proxy means testing. Right?
Okay.
And it has a sort of complex name, but what it does is it looks at asset ownership.
Okay.
Right? So it looks at whether households own a boat or a tractor, because the logic there is if you have a boat or a tractor, you probably are fairly well off, right? You're not the poorest of the poor. They look at the kind of house you live in. So if you live in a mansion, for example, you certainly don't need samurti, right? Yeah. So it's almost that basic logic test to see whether you should be eligible or not. But of course, there are criticisms of this as well. And we certainly heard some of it in yesterday's session, in that, it can not be as accurate as you need. And one of the big issues that we have identified is that it may not really necessarily identify the newly poor. Right? So someone could have just lost their job. So even though they have a tractor, they can't liquidate it immediately. So then there is no way to really identify a good mechanism of whether that person really needs this emergency benefit or not.
Yeah.
So having a system in which somebody can apply for the grant and then can get it is always good. So having that ability to apply and having the funds to respond to it is always a good thing.
Yeah.
And then what we have been doing a lot of work in at LearnAsia is looking at other new types of indicators that could could kind of help identify whether these people are newly poor or not, right? And I think Verite has done some work recently in looking at electricity consumption.
Okay.
So we're really interested in that as well, and we're actually interested in looking at changes in electricity consumption over time and how that can, change with your change in income, because then that seems to make a lot more sense, right?
Yeah.
Because if you have, lost your income, you're probably going to not keep your lights on all the time. You may not use, your fans all the time.
Yeah.
So that may be slightly more sensitive to the current situation. We've also been looking at call detail records and satellite imagery, which really provides real-time data, which is another thing that is tough to find. It's freely available. So you need to be able to use these different types of data streams and then look at how that can be used to identify the newly poor. So if you take satellite imagery, for example, you can look at night lights, right? So again, looking at electricity consumption and seeing, okay, what areas are well lit up, right? Because that means people in that area are probably well off.
Yeah.
So there are all these different types of studies that are coming up from Togo, from India, from Philippines. There was actually some work done on Sri Lanka itself a few years ago.
Okay.
So we can capitalize on all these different, new exciting data streams. And certainly for us researchers, it's quite exciting.
Yeah.
But it does have a lot of potential in trying to solve this targeting error. It may not be 100%, but at least it should help ease the problem of targeting to a certain extent.
Yeah. So in terms of delivery, what would you say are the challenges in that aspect?
Right. So delivery there are many different issues that can come up, right? So I'll start off with one of the most basic ones, in that people may have to travel long distances to go get their benefits, right? Because right now what we have is a cash out system. And we actually have quite a fragmented system in terms of our entire social welfare scheme. So if a household is getting samurti, for example, they need to go to a samurti bank. Then for other different types of benefits, disability, thalassemia, whatnot, some cases you need to go to the post office. Sometimes you need to go to the divisional secretariat. There are so many different touch points to which you need to go. And it's quite cumbersome for anyone who is receiving it, because they are on limited bandwidth. They're probably trying to find another way of earning their money as well, or at least they should. So I think it's really important to create a streamlined mechanism, right? So one of the things that we've been thinking about is why not transfer all the funds to a bank, right? Not just a Samurdhi bank, which is what's used specifically for the Samurdhi scheme, but why not to any sort of commercial bank, right? So it could be a Bank of Ceylon, it could be a People's Bank, a commercial bank, Sampath Bank, any of those kind of banks. Or why not use mobile money as well, right? Because mobile phones are everywhere, right? Nearly every household has a mobile phone or a bank account. In fact, our survey from last year shows that 98% of households have either a bank account or a mobile phone. 75% have both, right? So this is really something that you can capitalize on. And these are the households that are receiving welfare, mind you. So there is a lot of opportunity there. And what we've shown through some of our statistical analysis is that even if you look at the poorest income deciles, right, the amount of distance that they'll have to travel to get to the nearest Samurdhi bank right now is about 8 kilometers. If you move to this system, it will halve. So that will help them in terms of travel costs, travel time, and certainly if they're on multiple different types of schemes, it will help them even more, right? And then outside the pure access problem, which is certainly an issue, it also has a lot of other benefits, because if these funds are sent directly to someone's bank account, for example, you don't need dedicated people to dole out the funds for every single scheme, right? So you're actually saving in resources on that. That if you're saving resources in terms of personnel, you're also saving resources in terms of money, which we know is really scarce these days. So this is another way of streamlining this and future-proofing it. Another thing that we really stand to benefit from is reducing leakages, right? Because we know that, especially when money goes from hand to hand, it can go to the wrong people. It can, people can pocket it, especially at a difficult time like this. So directly sending it to the recipient has the potential to get rid of those things as well. So it can help in many different cases. I mean, you started with asking the issues with delivery. So, I mean, I think the solution tends to tackle a lot of these. So it is something that we've been thinking about and we hope can be pushed through.
So what about adequacy of benefits, and how would you say inflation has affected this?
Yeah, so I mean, this has been a perpetual problem in Sri Lanka, right? And it really starts from the fact that we don't allocate enough money towards welfare, right? If you take 80% of our government revenue, it goes towards paying pensions and salaries of government sector staff. So there's lots of money goes towards defense. So we have a fundamental problem in how we've been allocating our resources, which also tells you a lot about how we got here. So there's a fundamental, almost paradigm shift that is needed to think about how we spend our money. Now, Sri Lanka has been spending a very small percentage of our GDP on social welfare, right? So we're starting off with quite a low base. And yesterday, Dr. Kidd was talking about the fact that countries like Nepal even spend a lot more of their GDP than we do, right? So the problem of adequacy of benefits really stems from the fact that little funds have been allocated towards it. And now we're in even more tricky situation because we have so little money to start with, right? So this is the perpetual problem. But the adequacy of benefits in and of itself is a problem. So even if we are able to, in a hypothetical situation in the future, able to put money towards these sort of schemes, we need to then make sure that the amount of money that people get is enough, right? So take the Samurdhi, for example. The average Samurdhi payout is 2,500 rupees per household, which is very, very little, right? And what we found is, especially with inflation, the value of that has gone down significantly. So even if you take the 5,000 rupee grant, right, that they started giving that out in April 2020, right? So we've seen so much inflation over the past year and a half that now to get the same utility as you would have in April 2020 from that 5,000 rupees, in May this year, we needed about 8,000 rupees. Now it's probably close to 10,000 rupees, right? So just to get that same utility, now we need to give people a bit more money, right?
Yeah.
And there we have sort of started moving in this direction because now they've adjusted it up to 7,500. But as inflation continues to be an issue, this is going to be a perpetual issue, which is why we've been thinking it's important to create a system that allows for these payments to be adjusted quite easily. Right? So we've moved towards formula-based pricing for fuel and whatnot. Why not for our social safety nets and these sort of welfare payments? So we can take inflation as one of the variables, but we can also look at the fact, look at whether any other benefits are being received, and then adjust accordingly. From scheme to scheme, the variables could be different, but certainly worth thinking about in that sense as well.
Yeah. So, in terms of the fiscal perspective, how sustainable do you think this is, and also in the current context with the debt crisis?
Yeah. So again, this is going to be a problem for the short, medium, and long term, right? So right now, I believe we're getting some assistance for this, which is much needed, and I think is being put into good use. But in the long term, it is something that we'll need to think about, and again goes back to that point that I made earlier, in that we'll have to really think about what matters to government and on what activities we channel our money into. So more on healthcare, more on education, more on these social safety nets to really protect these people. So from a fiscal perspective, that sort of shift will have to happen in order to finance these.
Okay. And I think finally, I just want to move on to the solutions, right? So, would you say you having a unified system under the welfare benefits board, would something like this work? Is this the big solution that we see?
That is certainly one of the solutions, right? So again, we have to think about which problem we're solving for. So we spoke about solutions for targeting, for inflation adjusting, all these different elements of welfare reform need to be tackled differently. So what the unified beneficiary database does is it just tries to deal with the fragmented system in which we're dealing, right? Because right now we actually had a look at the gazette on the functions and duties of the cabinet. And what we found is that there are at least 5 different ministries that are overseeing institutions that take care of different schemes that look specifically at targeted welfare, right? So Samurdhi, disability, those kind of schemes, including Triposha, which is really important for young children. So there are multiple different agencies that handle this, and we're dealing with problems of the different agencies actually sometimes doing the same work. So there's duplication of effort, there's higher administrative costs, there's increased transaction costs for the user as well, right? Because say somebody, the main breadwinner of a family passes away, for example, which is the same example we used earlier, and say they were on 5 different schemes, then because there are so many different agencies handling these different welfare schemes, there are 30 different lists. So then if that person was on 5 different schemes, they would have to go and update this information each and every single time, right? And which is a huge burden and strain on individuals as well, which is really one of the big cases for creating a unified beneficiary database. Because what that will do is they'll take the Samurdhi list, the disability list, the PAMA list, everything together, and they'll create one database in which you'll be able to say, okay, this individual is on all 3. And government right now, shockingly, doesn't have that insight right now. So that creates a level of opaqueness which is not needed when dealing with this sort of issue. So what then that will do is also allow the Welfare Benefits Board and the people working in this area to target the schemes better, right? So building a good database is really a precondition to getting all the other things done. So it's a start. It's not the be all and end all, but certainly will help. The Welfare Benefits Board itself, it's not something that has been instituted in Sri Lanka over the years. So it first came to be with the passing of the Welfare Benefits Act in 2002. But it has become a political thing almost, because with certain regimes it comes into place, with certain regimes it doesn't. But it does have a lot of promise, because what it does is that it brings all these other different schemes under its banner, right? So then the Welfare Benefits Board is in charge of targeting and then actually allocating money for these different programs. So at least it will reduce some of the fragmentedness of this scheme. So it's that again is a start. It's been slow progress on this. I think they've started work on this in 2017. Was supposed to finish this year, if I'm not mistaken, but I don't think a lot of progress has been made. And again, I believe that's because there's been a lot of resistance, because people don't want this on the ground, don't want this database, because it takes away agency. But it is something that needs to be done to move forward.
And with that, I think we'll end our session for today. It was great talking with you, Gayani. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You can listen to this podcast on Anchor, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And remember to follow us on all our social media platforms for more exciting content. See you in the next episode.